Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. This is Victor Shi. It is Thursday, June 29th. More than ever before, it seems like Vladimir Putin is in a weaker position now than when the Ukraine-Russia war first started. And as a result, that means that Ukraine is in a stronger position than when the war started too. Today, we're going to talk about what you need to know about the situation in Russia and what it will take to put an end to the war. And to do that, I am joined by someone who keeps us all informed on TV and elsewhere, and he is General Barry McCaffrey. General McCaffrey, it's so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Very good to be with you, Victor.
So I have to start off by asking you about events that unfolded almost exactly 1 week ago today, and that is this attempted takeover by the Wagner Group and Yevgeny Prigozhin. First, tell us what the Wagner Group and Prigozhin stand for. What do we know about them?
Well, I tell you, the entire situation is so astonishing to me. I spent decades watching, studying the Russians, dealing with them directly. It makes one almost yearn for the commies to come back. In the old days, the Soviets tended to be stupid, methodical, judicious, trying to play the long game, avoiding disasters for Russia. All of it's out the window. So for several years now, Mr. Putin has managed to get away with violent aggression in the international community, whether it's Syria or Georgia or Chechnya or siege of the Crimea, and now the ongoing war in Ukraine. It's just astonishing. He has blatantly, openly violated international law and gotten away with it.
Yeah.
So here he's now stuck in a situation. Mother Russia can't sustain this. Essentially, poor Russia is a sort of a moderate mid-center grade economic community. All they've got is oil and gas. They don't make things that people want to buy. It just, the economy is smaller than that of Texas or California or Italy.
Wow.
So he got out over his skis and he started using, as surrogates for the Russian armed forces, mercenary groups, not just the Wagner group, but Chechnya, and there's other odd militias that he's given a license to kill. And then it got away from him. So for the last month, I've been watching Prigozhin, and in just amazement that he could say these things, that he wasn't immediately arrested, detained, disappeared from sight. I don't understand where this is going to go. Putin has been off-gassing vulnerability. He looks weak. He is weak. His armed forces are incompetent and corrupt, and apparently not really following his bidding. Some of the numbers, let's say Wagner Group had 25,000 fighters, but who knows, 10,000 civilian contractors. The entire security apparatus of Russia is 1.4 million men and women, and National Guard and FSB and GRU and the Army, Navy, Air Force. Nobody made an effort to stop a tiny element of 8,000 fighters that drove a seized tactical headquarters in Rostov-on-Don and headed up to Moscow, darn near unopposed. So this is a scary situation.
You talked about this last week, and you reminded all of us that Prigozhin is not a good guy. But I'm wondering kind of what you think was behind the calculus. I mean, was he angry with Putin? Why did he choose to invade Russia when he did? And what was your reaction to that at the time?
It was just amazing. And by the way, as it started to unfold, I'm patting myself in the back as I say this. I said, there's going to be no big fight there, that somebody's going to buy him off or threaten him off, which is precisely what happened. I mean, 8,000 fighters driving up to Moscow, and all the pundits now are saying, well, he could have seized the capital. No, really, I don't know. But Putin has to kill him. He has to detain him. He has to eviscerate Wagner Group and place their fighters into the armed forces or tag them as radioactive opposition and send them home. So we're going to have to watch this in the next, I'd say, 90 days. How does Putin try and stay in power? If he doesn't take on this independent actor, Prigozhin, and by the way, this lad was making maybe $500 million a year out of his operations in Africa, stealing gold and diamonds and
Yeah.
rare minerals. It's a group of gangsters. There's some similarity to Germany 1935, 36, 37, where Hitler, this messianic fellow, surrounds himself with thugs, people that were drunks and sociopaths and outcasts from society. That appears to be what Putin's doing. We got to remind ourselves the Russians tend to be brilliant people. Chess, mathematics, physics, literature, the valor of their soldiers in World War II was legendary. And here he's got these nincompoops that are running the armed forces and the other institutions.
Yeah. I mean, this so-called coup really lasted only a day. I mean, less than I think maybe a day. And apparently there was some deal struck with Belarus, which is part of the reason why Prigozhin pulled out. I'm wondering what type of deal you think was struck and what that now means for Russia. You mentioned kind of the Putin's, I guess, rule. Does anyone challenge him? Is Prigozhin trying to challenge him at all, or is that not the case, do you think?
Well, I think Prigozhin, by the way, wasn't a member of the club. He didn't go to any of the military schools. He wasn't a big university graduate. He wasn't an economist. He was a thug, a thief with $1 billion and a charismatic personality and sort of a Western equivalent of a cracker approach to nationalism and populism that was doing some damage to Putin in the using some of these social media. But to understand Prigozhin, he choked out a woman at age 19 on the street, he and some buddies, and then they stole her purse, her earrings, and her boots and ran off in the dark. That's who he is. So when he drove up to the gates of Moscow, he wasn't getting feedback that the director of the FSB was going to welcome him. All these oligarchs weren't going to tolerate this guy stepping forward. Somebody else may, but it's not going to be this guy. So now Putin's got to act. He's got to solidify his support. I don't know if he can pull it off. In the short term, he can. He's got tremendous personal security. He spends a lot of his time outside of Moscow in his dacha, surrounded by several thousand security people. Armored train when he moves. He didn't want to fly places. But in the 5 years to come, it's hard to imagine how he survives all this.
Right. I mean, even with Prigozhin now, I remember last Saturday seeing videos of protesters on the street confronting police and Russians who were kind of, I think, mobilized by what they saw with Prigozhin. How dampened is Putin's support after this? And how do you think Russians overall feel about Putin and the war?
I don't know. Our intelligence agencies have a much better feel for this. In public, the support for Putin seems to have solidified after this.
Yeah.
And a lot of Russia, of course, isn't Moscow and the major cities. A lot of it's a rural, gigantic, empty, impoverished, uneducated mess of a country. And those people, I think, they watch Russian state TV. I'm watching it with translated subtitles. It is horrifying to me what you hear on Russian state TV. And by the way, apparently Putin listens to it all the time too and approves of the message, employing nuclear weapons against France and Germany and the UK and hitting Washington, D.C. And what is going on? The Russians I dealt with on arms control in the Kremlin, in the Ministry of Defense, would never have said things like that in private. It's just utter madness. So it's a very tricky, risky situation. I think basically this enterprise, Putin's enterprise, is coming apart, and we're going to have to be very alert. Fortunately, the allies rallied around NATO, the European Union, the Western powers, the Japanese. Everyone's concerned. Xi in China now will back off this. He's going to look at this imperfect tool and say, my gosh, what have I done? And of course, a lot's riding on that also. We absolutely don't want military confrontation with China, nor economic or political confrontation. And to the extent that Russia pulls off being an aggressor nation, it's not good for the optics in the Chinese system either.
So, I mean, you mentioned this kind of enterprise unraveling. What happens once that happens? I mean, like, what should we be preparing for? What should President Biden and other allies be preparing for in the case that that does happen? What does that look like?
Well, oh boy, that's a good question. You know, the Soviet Empire at its greatest included countries that hated the Russian, Poland, the Slovaks, these people, but at the heart of it was Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia. These were sort of Russian leaning culturally countries. And that's what, of course, Putin tried to reunite. He said, I'm going to rebuild Mother Russia.
Yeah.
Inside the Russian Federation, as you know, there's actually 100 other ethnic groups. I mean, there's pockets of Muslims in separate states within 500 miles of Moscow. So if this thing comes apart, Russia itself is not a monolithic, ethnic, pure country either. It's a tricky situation, partially because the Russians have a lot of nukes, including a couple of thousand tactical nukes. Some of them didn't even have serial numbers on them, for God's sake, never mind two-man control and adequate ways to safeguard them. So we got to watch what we're doing here.
Absolutely. Let's shift to talking about Ukraine in the remaining minutes we have. First, give us a brief assessment about where Ukraine stands now, more than a year and a half after the war started. How much better of a position is Ukraine in right now?
Well, I think it's pretty good. You know, I've been in and out of Kyiv, and as the Soviet Empire came apart, and it really was a fragmented, corrupt. There were no institutions of government there that were democratic or rule of law based. A bunch of thugs, and somehow they managed to have a revolution, and they stood up and said, "We want to be part of Europe. We want to be a country rule of law," and they did it, and they pulled it off. Astonishing. So I hate to say this, but a lot of good has come out of this war. They suddenly emerged a brilliant political leadership, not just Zelensky, but a bunch of other folks to pull this country together. Their military leadership, these were civilians, some 28-year-old civil engineer who's now a battalion commander and fighting effectively and absorbing Western technology. So it's still a lot of corruption, a lot of factionalism. The Russians are destroying the economies. Fortunately, the global 50 plus nations of the contact group are providing not just military aid, but economic and humanitarian aid. So Ukraine's been such an admirable statement of resolve, and the integrity of Zelensky's leadership is really remarkable.
It's incredible. And it just reminds me of kind of everyone here at home right now, all the members of Congress, particularly those on the right, who say we shouldn't be spending money on this war. But it seems like a lot of the funding that we helped Ukraine kind of get and a lot of the resources have been put to good use and are really making a difference. Would you say that's correct?
Well, I think the Biden administration, Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary Tony Blinken, and others, Treasury Secretary, CIA Director, he's got a remarkable team around him. They did step up to it. They're being extremely cautious. Having been to 500 meetings in the White House and National Security Council, either sitting against the wall or as a principal, we got to respect the fact that Biden is extremely concerned about horizontal escalation of this war, attacks against Finland or whatever, or vertical escalation in which Putin might use tactical nuclear weapons. I think we've been overly cautious. But if you're being held accountable as the President of the United States or the Secretary of Defense, those are the concerns they're facing. But I think now we got to tip this thing over and give the Ukrainians the tool they need to eject the Russians. I think that's where we got to go.
And that was going to be my final question is, that's more of, I guess, from a government standpoint, but what should we, as just ordinary citizens, people watching, listening, be doing here in America to make sure that we can help Ukraine win and beat Russia and Putin?
Stay engaged, be civil, vote in the primaries, vote for people only of character. Stay engaged as you are, Victor, for God's sakes. understand that your voice in this system actually counts, can be heard. Stand up for politicians who have integrity. Liz Cheney, for God's sakes,
Yeah.
1,000 years from now, her place in history is assured. So we got to get back to electing people of character.
Absolutely.
Also on the left, we have some goofy lads and lasses on the left.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that feeds these nutcakes who are angry, authoritarian. A lot of these people on the right have not read the Constitution of the United States. They have no respect for American values. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So stay engaged. Your voice will be heard.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. General McCaffrey, thank you so much for all that you do to keep us informed and keeping us engaged in this effort to win this war for Ukraine, but also defeat Putin. Thank you.
Victor, thanks for your leadership. And stay at it.
Thanks so much, Barry. Well, that was a wonderful episode with General McCaffrey, who just comes at this with such a wealth of knowledge and experience. So thank you, General McCaffrey, for joining me today. And hopefully all of us, just like you said, will continue staying engaged in this fight, because the fight is not over by a long shot. And we just have, this is a long end game. And we're seeing Ukrainians right now, and also President Zelensky, they are showing us what it looks like to stay engaged in this fight, what it looks like to have a fragile democracy and to fight for a democracy that just is not a guarantee. So I draw my inspiration from people like them in Ukraine, and hopefully you do too, and we'll continue to stay in this fight. Just a couple of things before we end today's show. I know a lot of people have been watching what's happening with the Supreme Court. As I'm sure everyone has been paying attention, the Supreme Court has struck down Harvard and UNC's program for affirmative action, and also thereby kind of wiping away other affirmative action programs as well. There's been some optimistic news at first. I mean, I think a lot of people started off saying, this is a terrible decision, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. It's not a great decision for anyone, especially anyone who stands to benefit from, accessing opportunity and accessing a higher education. But at the same time, it seems to be very narrowly tailored in the sense that it gives people a way to express other ways, that they might be impacted by this decision. But at the end of the day, it's just yet another kind of indication and perception to Gen Z, which is becoming increasingly diverse, which cares about diversity, which cares about, a class that looks like our generation. It's becoming increasingly clear to Gen Zers that, this is a court that just does not reflect our interests, that, there is no reason to get rid of a program like affirmative action, but yet this court did, and it strikes a blow at, I think, a lot of Gen Zers out there who are losing trust in the Supreme Court. But I think it's going to have a backlash, and I think we'll see what happens tomorrow with the student loan forgiveness program. I'll keep you all posted on that, but that's expected to drop tomorrow, as well as some other cases. So we will be watching the Supreme Court very closely, but at least what happened today isn't a shocker, and there is a lot of concern. There's a lot of alarm bells. Ellie Mastel on Twitter has been great about kind of reinforcing the idea that, they say that this would hurt Asian Americans, but every single thing that hurt Asian Americans pre this decision are still in place. It's just that they aren't allowed to take race into consideration. So there's a lot to, unpack, but follow people like Ellie Mastel on Twitter. And just as a student, as a young person, as an Asian American, it is a disappointment that this court did this, but unsurprising. And it reminds us all in 2024, we cannot take for granted the importance of our voice, and also the importance of voting for President Biden, because we cannot afford to elect a Republican who could impose another round of harsher and kind of more extreme right-wing judges in 2024. So that's the challenge ahead. And just like General McCaffrey said, it takes all of us to vote for people who have principle, for people who will stand up for democracy, and for people who have reason and morals. So that is another kind of, it seems like that's a lot of our kind of reminders these days, but it's so important now. And it's because of people like you that give me hope. So thank you for watching this episode of On the Move with myself. I'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific time. 6 p.m. Eastern time, 3 p.m. Pacific time, right here on youtube.com/Politicon, or on my Twitter page right here, Victor Shi 2020, which I'm sure some of you are watching, but you can find me right here on YouTube or on Twitter. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode every weekday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific, right here on youtube.com/Politicon or on Twitter. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Thursday.